enthusiasm of the Canadian delegation, for Jewish citizens in 1948, successive Canadian governments formed by the two major parties have supported Israel's right to exist as a sovereign state free of harassment. The Canadian people are proud of the contribution to maintenance of peace in this area of the world being made by 2,000 Canadian military personnel serving with United Nations peacekeeping forces in Cyprus and the Middle East, boosting Israel at one of the most difficult, unique in the idealism, dedication, and motivation of its free speech, free elections, and free court.
Mr. Ambassador, Bill, dear friends, some of my best friends are foreign ministers, and some even represent friendly countries. And when I argued with them in New York, before New York, and after New York, that their countries should vote against the invitation to Yasser Arafat to address the assembly, those who voted for inviting him, or their courage permitted them not more than to abstain, explained to me that by inviting him to the political arena, they will moderate him. He will become a domestic animal. He will abandon his terrorist methods. He will change his aims. And then Israel will have somebody to negotiate with. Some of them meant it. Although foreign ministers are not supposed to be naive, some are. Not the Israelis. Being myself a citizen of the Middle East, very much involved, almost day to day, with Arab affairs, locally and regionally and privately, I warned them that contrary to their expectations, the so-called PLO will interpret the invitation to the assembly not as a gesture of goodwill, as a new vista for activities as a substitute to terrorism, but a sign of victory, that they managed to receive directly or indirectly international recognition, not in spite of their destructive aims, but thanks to their aims and methods. Now, what were the events after the assembly? Of course, we had Rabat, the summit, the Arab Summit Conference in Rabat, Morocco, where one could sense already the feelings of many of the moderate, or at least less extremist elements in the Arab world as being already defeated by the assembly. Then came, of course, the infamous speech of Yasser Arafat in New York. And I must pay him only one compliment in quotation marks, that he remained himself. For a while, I was afraid that he might try to appear as a peace-loving leader, as a moderate statesman, as a man who is seeking only peace and understanding with the Jews. But it seems that terrorism is part not only of their philosophy, their way of thinking. This is really the embodiment of the spirit. And he simply couldn't overcome his own emotion as well as the opposition which he might have confront when he comes back to his gangs, had he been a little more moderate. So the rest of the world, including my naive colleagues all over the world, could witness the result of their action or lack of action. Now, is it a surprise that even before the dust of the Rabat conference settled down, and before the shameful ovation silenced in the big hall of the United Nations, we had the Beit Shan tragedy yesterday. And the deputy leader of the PLO, an hour after the tragedy, makes an announcement saying that this is not a military action. This is a political measure. Killing women and men, innocent people, this is a political measure. One needs really tremendous belief and faith in politics to remain a politician if these are the political measures that one can expect in the latter part of the 20th century. This is not an accident, dear friends. It isn't an accident that the so-called PLO decided to turn 1974-75 into a decisive year in which they wanted to be recognized, because they felt that as a result of the Yom Kippur War, some of the Arab countries are beginning to realize that they cannot beat the Israelis on the battlefield, even if we are taken by surprise, unfortunately. Which I hope will never happen again, in spite of that great victory. And some movement towards a political progress, I wouldn't say Syria, after a similar agreement was signed between us and Egypt. And I believe that agreements are preserved and will be preserved as long as they serve both sides. And somehow, maybe not objectively, but I'm trying to be fair to our neighbors, that the disengagement agreement, including the presence and the devoted service of UNDOF, the United Nations Observatory Force, served very well both Syria and Israel. Objectively speaking, it can continue to serve very well both sides in the cause of peacekeeping and preparing the ground for political progress in the future. Because no Arab country is excluded from those parties with whom we wish to negotiate peace agreements. And the third country of Egypt, this country which needs peace more than anything else in order to develop her own socio-economic infrastructure, raising the standard of living. Why should they be under the control of terrorist gangs Maybe we need a little more time. Maybe it's too early to speculate. My guess is that the major victim of the Rabat conference in the long run will appear the Palestinians themselves, because they pushed the situation into such a corner. Negotiation is concerned, I'm afraid that the situation right now is not the best one to try and even make the preliminary inquiries what would be the inclination of the representatives of the Palestinian community in the administered areas. But I, on my part, never associate the Palestinian Arab community with the PLO. We mustn't identify them with the so-called PLO. And if there is a future for a Palestinian identity, in addition to what they have acquired already historically in Transjordan, the future lies with the constructive and moderate elements of the Palestinian community in the administered areas. And this, I think, is one of the hopes for the future.
Cool.
Saved me today from writing a very severe protest to the State Department. When I heard the first statement, I thought that this statement really deserved, this time, a very firm comment on our part. But when he realized, I think, that what he said was misinterpreted, he went on the air, as you say, on the television, and corrected his statement. And as a not yet sufficiently trained diplomat as I am, I prefer, of course, to accept the interpretation, and I shall try to commit America to this interpretation.